Again, a different setting each week. Right now, we're back to the old Zoom setting versus what was called the OWL setting. We're experimenting with different things. I hope you all hear me up there. Just give me a thumbs up for those that are, there you go, lots of thumbs up. And those in the room, you hear me okay? From wherever you are, okay? We have been talking about Shema Yisrael, and in this prayer we say, B'chol nafshecha, we give ourselves over with everything we have, all of our heart, and all of our soul. And we've been talking about what is the definition, what does it mean with all of our soul? And we'll get back on that theme very soon. I want to repeat a little bit of what I spoke about this past Shabbat in my sermon, because it's appropriate for what we're discussing here about giving oneself over completely to God. Because I think there are various different levels of giving ourselves over completely to God, and the definition of completely to God. And in each of our own lives and in each of our own relationships with God, and on each and every single day perhaps, we define it slightly different depending on what's happening in our lives. This past week's portion dealt with Jacob. He is coming to Haran. He's running away from his brother Esau. He's going to a foreign land, outside the land of Israel. And he's there to find his mother's family so that he could be taken care of by them and perhaps marry a relative from his mother's family. And it's a difficult portion because he goes from the character of Esau right to a character of his uncle Lavan, who is a swindler, who is a thief, who's a dishonest person. And we have the interactions that take place between Jacob and his uncle, which will ultimately be his father-in-law as well. And this entire portion has the dealings that take place between Jacob and Lavan until the end of the portion. After 20 years, it's time for him to run away from his father-in-law. He's now married to 4 wives. He has 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel. He has a daughter, Dinah, and it's time to leave. But Lavan won't let him leave, so he has to escape. And again, you have a pursuit. Last portion, pursuit by his brother, now a pursuit by his uncle / father-in-law. And that's how this portion goes. It's a difficult portion if you're Jacob. But it's interesting that if you look at the entire portion and you focus on the characters of the portion, the example I gave on Shabbat is in Hollywood you have the best actor and you have the best supporting actor. So there are the main focus of the portion, the main characters of the portion, and then a lot of supporting characters of the portion. If you looked at last week's portion, who was the main character? Jacob. Supporting characters, Lavan, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah, the children as they're born. But Jacob is the focus. God plays a major role in the portion, of course he does as well. But there is another character in the portion. Jacob's name is mentioned 57 times. That's Jacob. There is another character that's also mentioned exactly 57 times. And it's an animal. Sheep. Sheep play a major role in the portion. Wherever you turn in last week's Torah portion, sheep are there. There's sheep everywhere in the portion. He comes to Haran, what's the first thing he sees? A flock of sheep. And then he lifts up his eyes and Rachel is coming with a flock of sheep. And then he has nothing to offer by way of gifts to Lavan. So what does he say? I'll take care of your sheep. And he becomes a shepherd. And then they negotiate salary, and the whole negotiations is about the sheep. If there's going to be speckled sheep, spotted sheep, solid-colored sheep, all different types of sheep. Every part of the portion talks about sheep. 57 times sheep is mentioned. By the way, Rachel, the wife that he wants to marry, his first girlfriend, what does Rachel mean in Hebrew? Sheep. So she's mentioned another 20-something times by the name Rachel, which is also sheep. So clearly, the author of the Torah, God, wants us to take a moment and think about sheep. What's the connection of sheep and this portion? Why is sheep so often mentioned in this particular portion? Yom Kippur wasn't too far back, still fresh in our memory. There is a song that we sing over and over and over again on Yom Kippur. And that particular song deals with the relationships that we have with God. Because we have many relationships with God. And so the song begins, the prayer begins that we sing with a melody, Ki anu amecha v'ata Elokeinu. We are your nation and you are our God. So that's relationship number one. We're your nation, we're your chosen people, and you are the God that directs us. Then we say, Anu vanecha v'ata avinu. We are your children, you are our father. That's a different relationship. But it's also about the relationship that we have with God. We say, Anu avodecha v'ata adonenu. We are your servants and you are our master. In every one of these relationships, you think of God differently. If I tell you think of God as your father, you're in a pleading mode. Because your father loves you, cares you, has mercy for you, and so therefore you're more in the mode of Tati, please help. If I tell you God is your master, you're thinking of how do I make my master proud of me? Do I polish his shoes? Do I set the table for him? What do I do if I am the servant and you are the master? If he is your king, it's a different relationship. How can I show loyalty to the king? And so we bring down all of these relationships and then we say, Anu tzonecha v'ata re'inu. We are your sheep and you are our shepherd. Now you would think that doesn't meet up with some of these other great relationships. I just said we're your chosen people and you are our God. That's lofty. You are our father. We are your children. That's lofty. We are your subjects. You are our master. That's lofty. And then we get into animals. We're your dog, God. You are our master. We are your dog. It doesn't measure up when suddenly we bring animals into the discussion. Or does it? Yes, Jack?
It does.
Because?
Because our small, minute understanding of the world, of the universe, compared to the deity's greatness, it's not even enough. It's more like we are ants.
So we're getting into various different types of relationships, but what I want to focus on just briefly here is the uniqueness of the sheep and why the sheep is found 57 times in last week's portion and why we use the sheep in this relationship, not other animals, which we could have used. The sheep is unique, besides for its taste, the sheep is unique in that it has total loyalty to its shepherd. It's not that it is trained to listen to its master, but by its very nature, it clings to its shepherd, and it's completely loyal to the shepherd, and it never questions the shepherd. Where you take me, I will go. It doesn't complain. Other animals can be trained, but it goes through a training process to break its nature. Okay? Those of you like me that used to love going to SeaWorld in the days of Shamu, right? Before Shamu was canceled and put out to pasture somewhere. But the Shamu show was great. This big whale would jump up and smile at you. He would wave to you. Then he would splash you if it was a hot day. So many tricks. But that wasn't in Shamu's nature. They had a trainer that trained Shamu that if you splash at this thing, I'm going to give you a mouthful of fish. So Shamu always remained in its nature, it liked fish. But it realized, because it's smart, that in order to get the fish, if I splash the people in that section, I get fish. If I jump on cue and I hit the ball, I get fish. It breaks its nature by following its nature that it likes fish. And the same with all animals, with the exception, the sheep is born with this innate nature. It wants a shepherd and it will follow the shepherd. And it has this total loyalty to the shepherd. Where the shepherd goes, the sheep goes. That's why we're compared to sheep. That's why the portion of Jacob building the 12 tribes of Israel is so filled with sheep. Because there is a time in our relationship with God where it is beyond our own intellect, beyond our own understanding, beyond even anything that we can accept, in which the only thing left to do in that relationship, you're my shepherd, and you know where you're taking me, and so I will go. I don't understand why there. I don't know why that field. I don't know why at this time. But the sheep never questions the shepherd. The sheep just goes. There's a time in our lives as Jews that we will be asked, and we are asked throughout history and in our daily lives, to look at God as our shepherd and to follow and to go where the shepherd takes us. Let's think about Jacob for a moment. Jacob had an extremely difficult life. Of all the patriarchs, he had by far the most difficult of lives. He goes through what I call tsaros after tsaros after tsaros, crisis after crisis after crisis. Now, Abraham was also challenged by God, but you don't find Abraham ever in pain. You don't find Abraham in anguish. Abraham passes the test because he's a man of complete faith. So even when he's told in the most difficult of tests, bring your son, your only son, and bring him to the mountain, Abraham is able to focus on doing the mission. Jacob, we find the emotion. In the stories of Jacob, we feel his pain. He has to run away from home because his brother is chasing him. And why is his brother chasing him? Because he listened to his mother, and he listened to what his mother told him to do. And he cries out to God. He doesn't like to be in exile, but he's always finding himself in exile. And he says the words to God, I am afraid. I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid of the harm he can do to my family. We feel that anguish. And then he has to deal with Lavan, and Lavan lies to him. And he works for 7 years for this man, his uncle. For 7 years he works only so that he can marry Rachel. And we know what happens on the wedding night. There's a switcheroo, and Lavan switches Rachel for Leah, and behold, he wakes up in the morning, and it's not the woman he thought he married. And he's in pain. And so Lavan says, hey, in our community, you got to marry the older first, but don't worry, you can still marry Rachel. Another 7 years. And then again, we keep feeling this man's anguish. We relate to him at times far more than Abraham and Isaac because we live that life of disappointments, of feeling cheated, of not knowing why is this happening to me. I've been good. And then as the portion continues to this week's portion, where he gets together again with Esav, and we think finally he could calm down. But no, he has the episode of Dinah. His daughter is kidnapped. His daughter is raped. We have an episode of Rachel dying young before they even get home to Isaac's home. His wife, Rachel, that he loves so much, passes away young and is buried on the way, the burial place of till today of Kever Rachel. Again, the pain of Jacob. And then we think finally, okay, now he's home. The story of Joseph unfolds in 22 more years of suffering for him. Jacob is the suffering of the patriarchs. And the message of the sheep then tells us is that when you can't make peace with what's going on and you have no understanding of what's going on, the ultimate level of that faith that we need, the ultimate level of bitachon that we need, is that God's our shepherd. There's a lot of times in our life that we are involved. Okay, let's use the example of a father-son relationship. Father-son relationship, the son is not going to always do exactly what the father says. Doesn't happen that way. At some point, there's independence. At some point, the son thinks for themselves, makes decisions for themselves, acts in a way the father may approve or may not approve, but there's an independence. There are times in our lives as a Jew, we use our own mind, we make our own decisions, we try to do our own things. And that's part of the relationship. But there's also a surrender time. The surrender time means surrender that God is ultimately your master, your shepherd, and is taking you where you need to go. At times it appears against your own will because you don't like where you're going. And that's where our faith needs to come in. That as a shepherd really does care for his sheep, God does care for us. And God will take us where we need to go, whether we are aware of it or not. You know, at the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob is speaking to Joseph alone, perhaps for the last time, it says, Vayevorech es Yosef, he blesses Joseph, Vayomer, and he says to him, Ha'elokim, the God, asher hishalchu avoisai lefanav, the God in whose my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, Ha'elokim, the God, haroe osi me'odi ad hayom hazeh, that was my shepherd from my birth to this day. What does he acknowledge at the end of his life? All those difficult places that I stopped along the way, I realize God was my shepherd. God was my shepherd. And that's what he's telling Joseph, to pass on to all of us. God was my shepherd. So in this portion that deals with the birth of 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel, it wants it to be sandwiched all around by sheep. So that you want to know Jewish tribes, how are you going to survive thousands of years of exile? Yeah, there'll be some bright spots along the way, but there are going to be many generations and decades and centuries that the only way you're going to survive is with this completely giving over of self, that God is your shepherd and you are his sheep. I told the story about this opera singer that always had these sold out shows. He was magnificent, and he would finish every show by doing a song on Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. That was his specialty. That was his song. And that's the way he finished every show. That was his encore song. Always to standing ovations. That's the way the show would end. By one show, this little Yidala, this old Jew, is in the front row. And as the opera singer is getting ready for his encore, he picks up his hand to get the opera singer's attention. And he says, tonight, can I sing Psalm 23 instead of you? It is an old man. He's gone through a lot. How do you say no? He must have a beautiful voice. He must be a cantor in some temple. He says, sure, come on up on stage. The fellow gets up and begins Mizmor LeDavid. He begins saying the psalm in Hebrew. He has no voice. He cannot carry a tune. But he's saying it as if he lived through with King David every word of that psalm. That he was there. He was in the concentration camps. He knows what King David is talking about when he says, the Lord is my shepherd. And when he finishes Psalm 23, there is no applause. There is no standing ovation. What there is everyone in the audience is wiping their eyes from their tears. So the opera singer says to him, I don't understand. I do this psalm better than anyone in the world. There is no one that does it better than me. And yes, I get standing ovation after standing ovation. But I've never moved the audience to tears. You come up here, you can't carry a tune, you're off tune the entire time, and the whole audience is crying. What's your secret? To which he says to the opera singer, you see, you, when you say it, you know the psalm. You know the words of the psalm and you know it well. But me, when I'm saying it, I know the shepherd. It's different. I lived this psalm. You sing this psalm. We talk about the Shema, and we talk about the chol nafshecha, giving of oneself, completely giving of oneself. Now, yes, we can talk about the idea that throughout history Jews gave their very lives, and we'll continue telling such stories. But there's also the idea of the giving of the self, where you put your own mind aside and you realize that your rational thinking cannot make peace with this, nor do you know what to do. And at that point, you completely surrender to the shepherd. That's b'chol nafshecha. We face that in our lives. One of those that went through the hell of the Holocaust was a man by the name of Chaim Shapiro. You may have heard me tell his story before, but it's a story worth repeating, and those listening out there in the world of Zoom and YouTubes and Facebooks, if you hear this story, tell the story over to others. Chaim Shapiro survived 4 concentration camps. And then throughout the concentration camps were the ghettos and the forced marches that he went through. At the start of the war, before it began, he had a beautiful family with a wife and 8 children. Within the span of just 12 months, he lost his wife and 7 of his 8 children, murdered by the Nazis. He had no chance even to sit shiva for his children or for his wife. After the war, Chaim, along with his only surviving son, his name was Barak, were liberated from Buchenwald. Liberation wasn't the end for most of those that went through a Holocaust, because then came the DP camps. Countries weren't exactly opening their doors to invite in those that survived. And so he wallowed in a DP camp with his son for 3 years, until in 1948 they gained passage on an immigrant ship and arrived in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. But you know what 1948 was in Israel? The War of Independence. So young Baruch Shapiro volunteered to fight in Israel's War of Independence. Literally days after arriving, after spending 3 years in a DP camp and after spending years in 4 different concentration camps and losing 7 siblings and a mother.
With no training.
No training. He's taken to a ravine, he's handed a rifle, he's taught how to shoot a rifle, and sent off to war. Now Baruch distinguished himself in battle, and he joined Yitzchak Rabin's brigade. And they were given the task of fighting to break the Arab siege of Jerusalem. And he was brilliant in battle. He received a field commission as an officer and was awarded a medal for bravery under fire. One day, soon thereafter, sitting in his tiny apartment in Tel Aviv, Chaim Shapiro glances out the window. And he sees what no soldier's parents ever want to see. There's a delegation heading up the path to his apartment. He's not a stupid man. He knows what that means. They say that Chaim Shapiro opened the door before they even knocked, and that he never read a telegram. He just crumpled it in his hands. Because he knew that his last remaining son was also gone. With regards to funeral arrangements, Chaim Shapiro made one request. He wanted his son Baruch to be buried in Jerusalem. That's what he asked for. Word spread quickly throughout Jerusalem that there was going to be a funeral arrangement, a funeral for someone who was the last survivor of one family, that 7 of his siblings died in concentration camps, and this brave hero who fought to liberate Jerusalem from Arab hands fell. There's no family in here in Israel, there's only a father. And so thousands come to the military cemetery in Jerusalem on the Mount of Herzl to participate in the funeral of Baruch Shapiro. None of them ever knew Baruch Shapiro before. None of them knew Chaim Shapiro before. But they wanted to pay their respects. Yigal Yadin, who was then the IDF chief of staff, this would be the man that would later discover Masada, stood by Chaim Shapiro's side. What Hitler did not finish in the crematoria ended by the hands of an Arab bullet. The last Shapiro son was being buried. As the coffin was being lowered in the ground, a strange thing happens. Chaim Shapiro begins to sing. Now, people thought he lost his mind. It's understandable. He's not with us. He's in a different place. Yigal Yadin puts his arms around Chaim to try to comfort him, to console him, asks someone to go get him some water so he can drink something, and he shrugs it all off. And he just continues to sing a song right in front of the open grave of his son. The crowd had no idea what to make of what was going on until finally Chaim Shapiro sees their puzzled looks and he asks to speak. And this is what he says. I have been through the hell, the likes of which most people could not even imagine in their nightmares. I lost more than 70 relatives in less than 12 months, including 7 of my own children, my wife, my parents, my uncles, and my aunts. I have no place to mourn for them. There is no grave with their name. They are just ashes in the skies over Europe. And I have no idea why they died. What did they do? Who did they harm? What was the war for? But this son, pointing to the coffin of his son in front of him, this son, I know why he died. He died so that we can have a homeland for the Jewish people here in Israel. This son has a grave. And his grave is right here in Jerusalem. And that's why I sing. When Chaim Shapiro finished speaking, he began to sing another song, this time grabbing people's hands and dancing around the coffin of his son. Hundreds of mourners joined him singing and dancing against the setting sun of the Jerusalem sky. If you ever have the occasion to visit Mount Herzl, Israel's national military cemetery in Jerusalem, perhaps you can stop by the section of the graves of 1948. And it's there that you will find this lonely grave of one Baruch Shapiro. When you look at that stone and you close your eyes and you remember the story that I just shared with you today, you'll understand why the Jewish people have never, can never, and will never be destroyed. You'll understand what it means when we say the words Am Yisrael Chai. That's B'chol Nafshecha. That's us giving ourselves completely over and understanding that there's something bigger than us. There's something bigger than one individual. And that this has been for thousands of years the cry of the Jew, that we will survive. We are an eternal people. And no matter what happens, we will survive. And we will give ourselves over to this mission, this chosen people mission that we have been given, even if it means our very lives. Back in 1835, there was an incident that took place in Slavita, part of Russia. It became known as the Slavita Libel. The story goes that there were 2 brothers. One's name was Shmuel, one name was Pinchas. Their last name was also Shapiro, the same name as the person of my last story, but no relation. These two Shapiro brothers ran a very successful Jewish publishing house that they inherited from their father called the Slavita Press. This publishing house churned out prayer books and chumashim and volumes of the Talmud and other sacred writings. It was an extremely high-quality printing press and binding company that they ran. It was the pride of the Jewish community. It was the main business of the city. And therefore, it also brought upon the anger of the anti-Semitic elements within that community, hated that business because it's what gave Jews parnasa. And the church at that time was quite anti-Semitic in this town. They too hated the Shapiro press, the Slavita press. One day a terrible tragedy struck when the Slavita press's bookbinder, an individual who suffered from severe depression, went into the synagogue one day and he committed suicide. If this painful incident wasn't horrific enough, the anti-Semitic priest from the neighboring city, who had long had it in for the Shapiro brothers, always looking for a way to initiate a libel, claimed that the brothers had the bookbinder killed. And they didn't have a hard enough time finding co-conspirators to come and back up this claim that they know that there was a plot by the owners of this business because of some dispute financially to have their bookbinder killed and claim that he killed himself. The brothers were immediately arrested on the trumped-up charges. They were thrown into prison in Kiev, where they were subjected to daily torturous interrogations, trying to force them to admit to the sin, to the crime. But for all the abuse that was put upon them, they refused to confess. They would not confess to something they did not do, no matter what. Beat us, kill us. You're not getting a confession out of us. This went on for weeks. This went on for months. Morning, afternoon, and night, they completely and unequivocally claimed their innocence. While they were in prison for this period of months, they managed to arrange for a tiny, small Sefer Torah to be brought to them. A very small Torah scroll. And every day they opened this little Torah, these two brothers, they recited the words from this Torah together. They studied from this Torah, and they got strength from the fact that they were in prison together with this tiny Torah. The summer of 1841, it's now 6 years after their arrest. 6 years they're in this prison. 6 years they're being interrogated. 6 years they're being pressured and tortured to admit. 6 years they're holding to their innocence. There's a trial. There's no confession, nor is there any evidence of any kind. But there's a kangaroo court, and the brothers are now given by the judge the final choice. This is what it comes down to. Either you admit guilt for the murder of the bookbinder, or your punishment will be to run the gauntlet. What's the running of the gauntlet? The running of the gauntlet was 2 rows of 250 Russian soldiers on each side, each with whips. And the brothers would be tied up, and they would have to run the gauntlet back and forth and back and forth. Each soldier they would pass would whip them. The judge says, unless you admit, you will run the gauntlet either 6 times or death will happen sooner. Those are your options. Admit, and you'll be treated fairly. Run the gauntlet and die, or run the gauntlet 6 times and survive in whatever physical shape you will find yourself in after running this gauntlet. The brothers made it clear that no matter what promises of leniency or freedom were dangled in front of them, they will never have a false admission come off their lips, and so they're prepared to run the gauntlet. The brothers' hands were tied around these long rifles affixed to their bodies, and then they had a soldier pulling each brother across the line. And as they passed each soldier would take their whip out and whip each brother. The Shapiro brothers passed through the gauntlet one time, a second time, a third time. They're surviving. During their last time, the yarmulke that was on the head of Pinchas Shapiro fell off while he's in the gauntlet. Pinchas Shapiro refused to move. And he's getting whipped and whipped and whipped. He can see survival at the very end. He won't move without the yarmulke. I've worn that yarmulke every day in prison for 6 years. I'm not about to let it be off my head right now. Finally, one of the Russian officers was so moved and so inspired by the bravery and the courage of this man. He picks up the yarmulke, puts it on top of Pinchas's head, and pushes him along. When this ordeal was over, many of the soldiers, cold and heartless though they may have been, bowed their heads in awe and possibly in shame to these two brothers. They had never seen such courage, such strength, and such resilience, and perhaps such holiness. Pinchas and Shmuel Shapiro were taken to the Kiev hospital and they were nursed back to their health. When they were well enough, they were sent to Siberia until Tsar Alexander II freed them 17 years later on June 1st, 1856. There's a very interesting epilogue to this story. That little Torah scroll that I told you about that they had in their prison cell belonging to the Shapiro brothers, which kept their spirits and their resolve going through the years of their imprisonment, was carefully guarded and protected for generations thereafter. And it was smuggled out of Russia, and in 1954 it was given as a gift to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. If you've ever seen a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe holding a small little white Torah, that is the Shapiro Torah. If you've ever seen the Rebbe dance on Simchas Torah holding a small Torah, that is the Torah he would dance with. If you've ever seen the Rebbe called up to a tiny Torah, that was the Torah that he was called up to. He treated that Torah with the respect that it deserved because it was held by two people that showed such mesiras nefesh, such self-sacrifice, such giving over themselves to God, to Torah, to Judaism. And it served as such an inspiration to them that the Rebbe wanted to connect himself to their lives through connecting themselves to their Torah. You know, one of the greatest sages of all was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva also lost his life by the hands of the Romans, one of the 10 martyrs, arrested by the Romans for his crime of teaching Torah. And the Talmud describes how in the final moments of his life, as his skin was being raked off his body, Rabbi Akiva cries out, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. His students are watching in horror. And the students say to Rabbi Akiva, even now when this is happening to you, you can pray the Shema, even now? So Rabbi Akiva answers his students in the final words he says in his life. He says, even now, of course now. All my life that I've said these words of the Shema, and I said, B'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, I wondered if I would have the strength, if it ever came to be that I would have the strength, if I was in need to give my life for God, would I have it? And now I see in this last moment of life, indeed, that I had that strength. Of course now, I say the Shema. I want to conclude this segment by saying this important message. Let's not get the wrong idea. We Jews do not glorify death. We are in no rush to die. We're not looking for any government that can possibly take us and make us die at the cross without bowing. That's not who we are. We glorify life. We want to live. We don't seek out martyrdom. Martyrdom always caught up with us. Ever since Abraham was thrown into a fiery furnace by Nimrod, millions of Jews in every era of history have given up their lives for their faith. Whether the hands of the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Muslim conquerors, the Crusaders, the Inquisitions, the Cossacks, the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, the Communists. Rabbi Akiva wasn't waiting around in his life for the Romans to come for him. He tried to run, he tried to hide, he tried to evade the Romans for as long as he could, just as all Jews always tried to run and tried to live. We don't have death wishes. In fact, we're not permitted to seek martyrdom. We're told to seek and sustain life. We try to bring heaven down to earth. We're in no rush to get to heaven. But ironically, it's because of our intense passion and love for life, because we appreciate the sanctity of life, that we're willing to surrender it in order to preserve that which makes it so precious and so sacred in the first place. And so, as a Jewish people, as a chosen people, we want to live, we want to survive, we will do everything to survive, even if it means the giving of ourselves, the giving of our very lives, so that there will be a future. Shapiro was able to see that although he lost his last son, he knew his son was fighting so that there would be an Israel. If there would be an Israel, never again would be a statement, not just for a poster board, but it would be a statement for the world, never again. Those that walked into the gas chambers, they were saying the words Ani Mamin on their lips, belief in God, belief that Mashiach will come, because they believed even at this lowest moment of Jewish history, there will be a tomorrow. We will survive. There will be a nation of free Jews one day. They dreamed of today, where we throughout the world have that freedom, where Israel has its freedom, where Israel is strong. All of the self-sacrifice, all of the Mesiras Nefesh of thousands of years was so that there can be a today. So that we can now take with our own free choice in the freedoms that we have, take the Torah, take the mitzvot, look into them, and incorporate them into our lives. And we'll continue next week. There will be class next week, Wednesday afternoon. I know it's Erev Thanksgiving, but there will be class. If you can't watch it live, you'll be able to see it on YouTube as a repeat. And there will be class the next Wednesday, which is the Wednesday of Hanukkah. We'll have class both Erev Thanksgiving and on Hanukkah, and that will be the last class of the fall semester. We'll take a break then, and we'll start up again with our winter semester. Take care, everyone.